Good afternoon, everyone. This is Athens-Clarke County Mayor Kelly Girtz. I am here on Community Conversation and I'm joined today by Athens-Clarke County Police Chief Cleveland Spruill, Athens-Clarke County Assistant Manager Deborah Lonon, and Athens-Clarke County Manager Blaine Williams. We wanted to come to you because there have been numerous questions, I think understandable questions, about how we managed last Sunday's gathering and how we're preparing for this coming Saturday's gathering and how our protocols and our decision making work generally. And I think you've delivered lots of good questions. So I'm going to give everybody a chance in a couple minutes to share some thoughts of the moment, and then we're going to get into your questions. And the only thing we've done is just arrange them kind of in a coherent fashion so that the questions will make sense in the way that they're read. I'll say for myself, I think this is a really raw time in American life, and especially for people of color. Of course, it comes on centuries of raw times and experiences. And right now we're hurting, frustrated, and we feel blindsided and forgotten and unheard, given all the events of the day. If you think about the killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor before that, Ahmaud Arbery recently, and so many others, we just see images of things that are wrong, and devastating, and unjust, and unfair. And disregard for human life is never acceptable. Brushing away the pain of people of color is not acceptable either. And for us as a local government, being silent is not something that we can do. We've got to be honest and forthright, because at the end of the day, it's not my community individually or anybody else on this program, but it's all of our community together, every one of us. So all of us have to work together to make Athens be the Athens that we need it to be. We need to acknowledge racial injustice and racism and know that that's real. And what that's going to take is listening and action, responsiveness, and continuous work in both the short and long term. I've had to put myself in the mirror in every day of my professional life, but especially this week, and say, we are far from perfect. And we want to know that everybody is valued as we get ever closer to perfection. So we can change together and we can grow together. We must grow together. We're different in Athens. We care about each other, and that caring is more than just talk. It requires action and taking a hard look at data, funding, transparency, and accountability, and a willingness to grapple with both history and the present moment, and have some challenging conversations. And so we appreciate you joining us, because we think this conversation is going to elicit growth and change, and we're continually committed to listening to you. And so here we are this afternoon. And just by way of introduction, I want everyone else joining me to just reflect on where we are in the moment before we begin to get into some of the questions that you've sent. So Chief Spruill, go ahead and begin if you would.
Well, good evening, Mayor, and thank you for having me. I want to begin by saying certainly watching the events that unfolded in Minnesota, where Mr. Ford was subjected to the treatment that he was subjected to and lost his life at the hands of a law enforcement officer, was deeply troubling to me. When I view that, I don't see how anybody can look at that and say that it's anything other than murder. And I agree that he rightfully was charged with that offense, and he'll stand trial for that. And I understand that there's a need to look at the criminal justice system and make improvements so that those type things can stop happening, because, as you mentioned earlier, they're happening all across the country. With respect to what's going on in Athens, we received information about a number of protesters that were going to be there. And certainly our primary objectives were a couple of things: making sure that citizens were able to come out and peacefully protest. And we wanted to facilitate that. And that's exactly what we did. But we also were concerned about information and intelligence, credible intelligence, about some individuals that were planning on being involved in that activity and resorting to destruction and violence. And so we wanted to make sure we had a security plan in place where we could prevent that from happening. And so it's difficult to make that balance or do that balance between security and allowing people to have their exercise their constitutional rights. But we did the best that we could given the circumstances that we had.
Thanks, Chief. We'll get into some of the blow-by-blow questions in just a little bit. Assistant Manager Lonon.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mayor. These are, in fact, very difficult times, but it's not new. The times have been difficult for a while, for a long time for many people. I am encouraged that we are having these conversations and that we're having them more boldly. I am heartbroken. I'm frustrated. I am just outright tired with all that's going on nationally. But I'm encouraged. I'm encouraged by the unity of the people here in Athens-Clarke County, and specifically as it relates to the events of last weekend. I think we did the best we could with the information we had. And I'm also gladdened that we are able to afford some additional information to our residents today. And I think once the residents are a bit more informed about what went into the decision-making process, they'll have a clearer understanding of what we were working with and how we came to the determination that we made. So I do thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to providing some of that clarity.
Thank you. Manager Williams.
Well, where I am in this moment is there's nowhere else in Georgia I'd rather live. And our city is not without faults, both present and historic, but it remains our city, and it's welcoming of others. I'm proud of all Athenians, and we do express a conviction and care about the ideal of what we can be collectively. I'm proud of this community, and because we care. I don't believe we're plagued by many of the deep-seated problems that we see unfold nightly in other cities across this nation. And as I've talked with people since I've lived here, I sincerely believe that we can virtually agree on all of the aspirations that we have, even as we engage in a debate on how to get there and how quickly to get there. An appreciation I have for Athenians is that it's in our nature to rail against the injustice that we see in this world and to speak very loudly and clearly. This is our city, and I don't believe that we have to duplicate the division that exists elsewhere to adequately express how we feel about this injustice. If you seek fragmentation, it's easy to find and create, and it's harder to mend. And so I just ask in all of this, in the wake of last weekend and going forward, that we not create an us and them dynamic in our city and between our citizens, but rather stand together and hold a better version of our human condition higher.
Thank you, Blaine. Appreciate it. The first set of questions are sort of some overall dynamic questions. And then there will be some specifically directed at me from those that you've submitted online, and then those that are a little bit more about the timeline and specific use of force and specific deployment. Overall, and I'll begin, but I want to hear a little bit from everyone. Somebody asks, how would you do things different? Go back to Sunday and make a different set of choices, or for future. One of the things that we're going to hit on thematically later really has to do, for me, with communication. And I'll just back up a little bit and say that really in the 4 hours I was downtown, from about 4 to about 8 on Sunday, I really had a gratifying experience in the presence of so many people who were like-minded about wanting to see societal change, institutional change, and positive behavior, and solidarity with one another, and common access to resources. And so I was gratified with that. If I had to do anything differently personally in my role as mayor, as policymaker, funding agent, and certainly kind of figure as head of government, it probably would have been to do some more direct engagement with people, knowing that there were individuals late into the evening who were present long after the sort of formal march took place, but knowing, as I think might have been referenced earlier, that there was what was and is believed to be credible intelligence about some dangers. I would not have wanted the very great number of peacemaking and peace-loving, but fervent folks who were there to be caught up with an element that was not peace-loving and peacemaking, and ultimately see the evening end the way it did as a result. So for myself, that's probably the thing that I would look to the most is from myself and from the government largely, better on the ground, individual to individual communication to ensure that we were doing everything possible to make and keep human life safe. I don't know if anybody else has any reflective thoughts as you think back about anything that you might have done differently or the way we'll posture ourselves into the future.
Well, I would like to, Mayor, if I might, and I say this not to step away from this at all, because I'm very much here with the mayor and the assistant manager and the chief, but to clear up some of the misinformation that's out there, and certainly some would say we had some delay in getting information out, and of course, information fills that void. I was out of town this weekend. I went backpacking in the mountains with my boys, and was not aware of this. And I say that to say, what would I have done differently? I've been asked that, and in all fairness, if you're not in the moment, it's easy to stand here and stand in judgment. So I will tell you, though, that with respect to the future, we are very much reviewing every action, every decision from this past weekend, and incorporating that for a better outcome this weekend. I do believe that the ultimate, that the intent of the decision makers around this weekend was focused on safety, and it was not some nefarious, dislike of the protesters, the content of what, and the intent of what they were doing, or a disregard for their speech. It was around safety. And I would just briefly like to talk about this because I've tried to. There's a lot of different perspectives, and nobody's necessarily wrong. It's just different understandings of a common event. And I don't want to oversimplify it, but I do want to speak about. I believe there's an ongoing tension between the notions of security and liberty, and there's no right balance for this. And I want to bring it home locally. We could really talk about this on a national level. But locally, the desire of the mayor and commission to institute a shelter-in-place order recently was seen as an infringement on personal liberty. Of course, it was done in the interest of public health. We could call that security. On the other hand, the right of a person to open carry a gun, some might say, is holding a person's liberty above security, and some people would argue it the other way. When I came home, what I found was there was a very well attended and successful protest where an excess of 1,000 Athenians were able to exercise their liberties throughout the day and into the night, expressing their pain and hope. My understanding is, as the day developed into night, there was information that called the safety of people into question, and the safety and security became, I think, a deciding factor over the liberty of the protesters to continue in that particular space when they've been asked to leave. And in the end, I think the objective of nobody being hurt was ultimately achieved, but I know the means of dispersing the crowd is being questioned heavily. I will tell you that we're going to take the lessons learned from this last weekend to achieve both objectives. We want to seek this weekend and the rally one where everyone has the ability to exercise their liberties and their rights, but while doing so, remain safe. And that's what we're committed to do.
All right. Anyone else want to think overall? Any lessons learned going forward?
I think I'll take a shot at that one also, sir. So anytime that you have a rapidly developing, uncertain type situation like we had that weekend, there's likely that there are some mistakes that are going to be made. We're not going to get everything right. So certainly we want to look at every decision that was made, everything we did, and look to see whether we can improve and do better going forward in the future. And certainly I'd want to be closer to the final decision when the force is getting ready to be deployed, and be more involved in that aspect of it. But anytime that we go through something like this, we will do a review of that use of force. We'll be completing that within 45 days, and we'll look at all aspects of that and look to improve. Certainly, with another protest coming up this coming weekend, we don't have 45 days to do that whole thorough review, but we've already looked at aspects of last weekend to try to see where we can do better and how we can improve.
Assistant Manager Lonon, do you want to any thoughts about moving forward?
So when you asked, just looking back, what would we have done differently? Over and over again, I replayed the events of the weekend and the information that we had to rely upon. And I asked myself, and Assistant County Manager Josh Edwards and I also had this discussion. The alternative would have been to not, for at least for us, to have not implemented a curfew. And over again, based upon the information we were relying upon, that would not have been in the best interest of our residents. It would not have been in the best interest of the safety of our residents. And the bottom line for me throughout the entire weekend, or at least throughout that time period in which the decision had to be made about the curfew, was what is in the best interest of our residents, what's going to protect them. So ultimately we look back, and there's no regret per se in implementing that curfew, but I do wish there had been a way to provide that information to our residents more quickly. I also look back and think that it would have better served our residents to share information post-rally, post-protest more quickly. I think that would have allowed people to become better informed.
Thank you for that. Next, somebody just notes, this wasn't a question per se, more a statement. Thank you to the police for otherwise being cool, except the gas, during the protest, blocking streets and handing out masks. And I'll note, just haven't been there for the entirety of the time. I think I noted to somebody really walking away that, I mean, if you didn't know everything that's happening in the United States right now, from St. Paul to Nashville to Atlanta, if you weren't aware of that, you would have thought that our officers were just in a kind of routine traffic management mode. Folks hanging out on corners, just making sure that everybody was safe moving around. I mean, I saw fist bumps, and I think somebody in the question noted handing out masks. I appreciated that mode enormously. I'll say on an individual officer by officer basis, I mean, I think of so many in the police department, Clarke, Epps, Eric Scott. I mean, I could go on and think we've got this great set of human beings who I know are bringing a lot of love for the community to their work every day. And you saw that really on the streets, on Broad and Thomas and Lumpkin. And I appreciate that too. The next question is, what are you going to do to ensure the First Amendment rights of all Athenians? And certainly from the policymaker perspective, we are going to continue to embrace those First Amendment rights, rights of association, freedom of religion, and freedom of speech. We are absolutely supportive of the upcoming rally this weekend. Just as for 25 years, I've attended rallies and demonstrations here in Athens around the need for peace domestically and peace internationally, gun violence, I mean, for environmental justice, for so many things. And I think that that's going to continue to be a hallmark of Athens.
Sir, if I can, I'd like to add something there. We have already been in contact with the event organizer to assure her that our goals will be to ensure that they are able to exercise their constitutional rights to free speech and protesting. That's what we're there for. We are blocking off streets, assisting them with the flow of people as they march, and making sure that they are able to do exactly that. But as the manager said earlier, we also have a secondary role there as well, and that's to make sure that we keep them safe while they are doing that and don't expose them to danger or unnecessary danger when that occurs.
Thank you, Chief. The kind of last sort of general overall question before some specific ones directed at myself, just ask, why did you allow Athens to repeat the mistakes of local and state governments nationwide? And I think that gets, at least in part, at the heart of what we attempt to do in Athens, which is to be a model city, to be a shining place that people can look to for better life. I think the reality is that myself, Assistant Manager Lonon, and Manager Williams all came here when we were relatively young folks, and we found a city that we really wanted to not just learn from, but be embedded in. Chief Spruill, you were a little more seasoned when you arrived here than any of us, but the reality is that we all want this, in fact, to be a city where we don't make the same mistakes. I'm gratified that we didn't have loss of life, that we didn't have people's places of work disrupted or their homes disrupted in the way that we've seen in some other cities. But I want to move beyond that and have this be a place where, in fact, nobody's attracted for anything other than to be righteous and forward-looking and strong-minded and unified. I think that's often the case, and there's no reason it shouldn't always be the case. And so, again, I think those communication tools are going to be critically important. I think our on-the-ground communication, as well as a couple of folks have mentioned, our post-incident communication is going to be important there. So this is a part of that. This conversation is a part of that. So I'm glad to have all of us here. Couple of questions directed at me specifically. Why were you out there peacefully protesting with us only to greenlight a curfew and militarized suppression a few hours later? Well, I do have to be clear. I really was proud to be among Athenians. I mean, there was nothing like being among 2,000 or more people, who, while they express themselves in different ways and have been different facets of the same jewel, really held kind of human dignity and decent treatment for others at their core. And then when the indication that a curfew seemed necessary to protect us from additional outside forces that had already been identified, I supported that because I wanted to see those outside forces not cause damage to human life. So as I had those conversations at 8:30, 8:45 that evening, that was very much on my mind. Let us not have the people who we know, very clearly know, are in the region converge on downtown, of our densest and really kind of most difficult to manage part of town. And so that was my interest. Certainly, sometimes think about the way that everything unfolds, and I joke that I wish I had a magic wand and I could micromanage elements of what happened, and that's absolutely true here. I wish I could have managed individual by individual, vehicle by vehicle, bit by bit, the communication that happened on the ground. But I know that I'm fallible and I'm not in that position. So, apologize to anybody who was physically or emotionally harmed who just turned out to be a peaceful, focused protester. I didn't want that experience to unfold the way it did. Somebody asks, do you or do you not condone the use of tear gas and projectiles on peacefully protesting citizens? I don't condone the use of tear gas and projectiles on peacefully protesting citizens. peacefully protesting citizens should be able to peacefully protest. And in fact, it's inherent that not be a right that's damaged in any way. Obviously, the other layer, and neither of these things makes the other one untrue, is that there were dangerous elements in and converging around Athens. And I understood tactically that the police took a step that caused peaceful people harm. And again, I seek to do every possible thing to avert that this weekend and at every future gathering, really by better dialogue, by ensuring that we as policymakers provide the funding and provide the assets and the resources that are going to mean that we have the best protocols in place and the best training in place for every department, but particularly the police department. And then finally, will our government apologize for using tear gas on peaceful protesters and commit to refraining from using military-style force on its citizens during peaceful protests in the future? And I think for those peacemaking individuals, that is my stand. That I've said in many contexts in this job and in my jobs in public education that it's important we always put ourselves in other people's shoes. We come to the table pickled in our own juices with our own experience. And I do find it my job to say, what if I had been on the asphalt on Broad Street and I just wanted to be very clear in my opposition to sanctioned violence. And I believe to have been the subject of violence after that. I mean, those two things are contrary to each other. So I know we can better and we will do better. There are a handful of questions for the manager's office. In kind of these following segments, sometimes I'll read 2 or 3 questions that are sort of conjoined or may have some relationship to each other. So the first one is just about the curfew. What's the review process and criteria that was followed before authorizing the state of emergency and curfew? So I don't know if Chief Spruill and Assistant Manager Lonon, you want to talk a little bit about that pivot from simply having seen probably 80% of the crowd disperse to formal implementation of a curfew.
Well, if I might, Mayor, just talk a little bit about the structure under which, in the criteria, I think, so that folks understand, there is a section of the Code of Ordinances, specifically the Emergency Management Ordinance, and it does give the authority of the mayor and commission certainly, and the mayor and the manager if there's a delay to be able to call for such a local emergency or curfew. And in the absence of the manager, the assistant manager is able to do this as well. And so there is an ordinance, there is a structure by which that authority is granted. And, the criteria by which, and it is a call that has to be made, but it is meant, and this is what it says in the ordinance, to preserve, protect the life, health, welfare, safety of persons within a designated area. And so those are the things that are allowed by the ordinance, and those are the things that, in consultation with the attorney's office, gave rise to the understanding that a curfew could be used to protect and help. And I think that was the intent in which it was brought about. So I wanted to share that, Mayor.
Okay. Thank you, Manager.
I'm going to add before Chief Spruill jumps in here that there was a process by which we discussed some of these options, and we didn't take it lightly. We wanted to make certain that this was a necessary step. And again, as I stated earlier, we really weighed the information that was provided to us. And what was first and foremost of importance to us was, again, the safety of our residents. And I will just add again really quickly that the alternative, which would have been really not enacting or instituting this curfew for Sunday night, for that limited period of time, to us just it seemed that the cost of doing nothing would have significantly outweighed imposing that limited time curfew. And so there is a process in place. We went through that process, we applied it. And of course, we understand going forward that it's really very important to give people as much notice as possible.
Thank you all for that.
And so, if I can add, first, I want to point out what the mayor, I think, has already mentioned earlier, and that is that this was largely a very successful, peaceful protest from 5 o'clock in the afternoon to almost 7:30 in the afternoon, and certainly we wanted to facilitate that and allow that to happen. I was communicating with Assistant Manager Lonon throughout the day to make her aware of the things that we were seeing, concerns that we had, and at about 8:15, based on intelligence that we had, and that's credible intelligence coming from sources like the FBI, the Georgia Bureau of Investigations, other state and local assets that we had involved, as well as what our own visible and covert resources were telling us on the ground. And all of those factors came in when I was reporting back to Mrs. Lonon about the situation there, and that went into the decision to actually finally go ahead and put that curfew in place. We don't take doing something like that lightly, because we know the concerns that it can bring up. And then once it was implemented beginning at 9 o'clock, and no force was used until after 12 o'clock midnight, or around 12 o'clock midnight, because we wanted to take our time and get the message out and give people the opportunity to clear out peacefully and without any further incident.
And Chief, maybe you could kick off with the next one, which is, can you tell me exactly who else, as far as county officials or staff, knew or were involved in the decision prior to the use of gas taking place?
Well, I spoke with Assistant Manager Lonon throughout the evening. I think you and I talked a couple of times on the phone. There was no specific discussion with either you or Mrs. Lonon about the use of gas. I think, however, that you both were aware that we had a range of tactics, force use tactics that we could deploy depending on the circumstances, and gas would be one of those. So there was no specific discussion about the use of gas, but there was discussion about the fact that we were going to move from a mode where we were going to try to disperse that crowd, and that was one possibility.
All right. Circling back a little bit to the curfew, there's a question as to kind of how curfews in the future might be differently implemented, given that it was sort of executed in real time in the 9 o'clock hour on Sunday. Is there another way to do that more effectively?
Can I respond to that first, sir?
Please.
So I think, as you said earlier, every time we go through something like this, we learn lessons, and you also mentioned that communication was key. And so I think this going forward into Saturdays and events coming forward, we're going to have a solid communication plan where we're utilizing our public information officers, both at the police department and at the county level, to get information out by all the available communication mediums, social media, radio, and otherwise. And so I think, yes, we can do better in the future should that happen, and we're prepared to do that, even starting this weekend.
Thank you, Chief. Chief, there are a couple of questions about police training and equipment, and I'll say that there were a number of questions that are broader in scope that next Wednesday, when you and I speak at 6 o'clock on our next community conversation, we'll get into. But for today's program, I really wanted to focus on managing rallies and particularly dealing with kind of this week's events. So the questioner asks, what crowd control training does ACCPD undergo? And according to that training, was this response appropriate? And then related to that, what evidence does ACCPD have that these dispersal techniques and tear gas make the arresting of protesters safer for protesters and for the police?
Okay, let me take the first part of that first. Athens-Clarke County Police Department, or all police departments, should understand the need to have a civil disturbance capability, crowd control capability. Unfortunately, upon my arrival, that hadn't been built out to the point where I would have liked it to be built out to. And so I had begun the process of acquiring equipment and beginning to develop training so that we got to that point. And so certainly going forward, we're going to want to improve in that area so that we make sure all of our officers have not only the equipment, but also the training that they need to perform at the level that we want them to. But there's again room for improvement in that area. And can you repeat the second part of the question? I'm sorry.
Yeah. So what evidence do you and your department have that the dispersal technique of use of gas makes the arresting of protesters safer, either for protesters or for the police? And while we're getting into gas, can you just talk a little bit about how that works in terms of the continuum of force against citizens? And, are there some circumstances where it's appropriate and others where it's not?
Yeah, so sure. So first, gas, even though it looks, it doesn't have a good visual, it doesn't present well, gas is actually a very low level, considered a very low level of force, because the way that it works is the gas, it's basically cayenne pepper. When it gets on the skin or gets in a person's eyes or in the mucous membranes through the mouth or other areas, it's an irritant and it causes intense burning. However, it dissipates on its own or through being flushed with water. And after a half an hour of it being on you, it will dissipate completely, and there's no lasting injury or effect to you. And so that is a preferred option and preferred choice over, a baton or taser or what they call a rubber bullet, but M40 round, because all of those options actually involve the striking of the individual and can result in bruising or trauma. And so that would be more injury that would be applied to that individual. So that gas is a preferred method. It doesn't look, the visual appearance of it, I can see that there's some concerns with that. And so that's one of the thought processes that went into using the gas when it was used.
And, just broadly, Chief, in general, what's the range of circumstances where you may use gas? And can you talk a little bit about maybe your experience in that? With that?
Yeah, I think the mindset in this tactical operation was we were really not trying to arrest people. We were trying to get people to leave and go home, and so and obey the emergency order and the curfew. We were just trying to get people to leave, and so the way that it was deployed in a manner where it wasn't deployed directly on the crowd immediately, but giving them an opportunity to understand that things were escalating rapidly and try to get them to leave. So in circumstances where we're anticipating that there may be a fight or violent resistance, then that would be the preferred method of dispersing a crowd, as opposed to in other circumstances where if someone was throwing a Molotov cocktail or, actively engaged in a visible threat towards you, then you would resort to higher levels of force.
And Chief, we talked about communication earlier, and I continue to believe that communication, both broadly of the public at large and then in direct dialogue, is an important area for us to improve on. Somebody asks here, how was the message that removal was imminent delivered to protesters? The note is, it appears the drone might have been difficult to hear by some. Did you communicate your concerns with the protesters directly outside of the use of the bullhorn?
So there was a message communicated from the aerial drone that was communicated numerous times. There was also a message, the same message being communicated from the Bearcat, which is the large vehicle that our the SRT team was in, again, using a bullhorn system. So the message was communicated. I know that it was communicated at least 6 times from the drone before and then throughout the incident. We know that before any use of force took place or the use of gas took place, we know that people in the crowd were aware of the message because we were monitoring real time Twitter feeds that the message went out, and almost verbatim was written in the Twitter message. This is what the police are doing, and this is what they're saying. So that message was received by that crowd.
Chief, thinking about that communication option for any future event, I suggested that, I would have been very glad to deliver direct messages. And I think many have noted, sometimes in a direct action protest, the intent is, as part of the action, to get arrested, not necessarily in a conflictual way, but simply to have cuffs placed on and be booked as indication of distress or concern about a broader societal ill or circumstance. I mean, is a tactic that the force can use simply to approach and say, is it your desire to be arrested so that you can participate in the protest in that fashion? And if so, we can facilitate that.
Yeah, I think we talked earlier on about changing tactics and what can we do better in the future. And I think that's certainly something that we will implement, provided that the circumstances wouldn't dictate otherwise. So if there's active violence going on, then we probably wouldn't be able to consider that. But in the future, if we had a crowd like we had on Saturday, we would probably likely approach them, ask questions about what your intention is, and see if we can get them to disperse that way, or if they want to be arrested, go ahead and go through with those arrests that way.
Okay, I'm very glad to hear that, and I think I say one of the, I guess for me, hallmark messages in social protest was that was developed really in the very early 1960s, lunch counter sit-ins, and part of what that crew did was very intentionally want to get arrested because they wanted to demonstrate distaste with societal norms of the time, just as people are wanting to demonstrate distaste with the oppressive, murderous tactics of police officers in places like Minneapolis and elsewhere. So I look forward to that being a viable tactic. I certainly understand if you're in the midst of multiple combatant kind of circumstances where people are in the street version of a bar brawl, that may be a less viable approach, but certainly for people who are sitting or standing, I wish to see that. A little bit kind of deeper about use of tactics. Were rubber bullets or any other projectiles used? And if so, who was it that shot those?
Yeah, let me first, and I think you're aware of this, I sent an updated memo to the manager yesterday acknowledging that we did use what's called sponge rounds and bean bags. That information was not relayed to me immediately following the incident. And when I looked for that information, so that was an error on our part because we did report a misinformation. So after speaking with our SRT commander, I did learn that bean bags and sponge rounds were used against 3 individuals. They characterized it as their use during in a defensive posture to prevent those individuals from picking up the gas canisters and throwing them back at the officers who were trying to disperse the crowd. So yes, there was some sponge and beanbags and sponge rounds that were used. The individuals they were used against fled, and they were not arrested or stopped at the scene. So I have no way of knowing whether they were struck or injured or not. When those are used, they don't cause serious injury. They may cause a bruise, but they don't cause serious injury. It's just a bag full of bean-like material or a sponge on the end of not a bullet, but and it hits a person and it'll sting, but it won't hurt. It won't injure them seriously. It's what's called a less lethal weapon, and it's not capable of killing a person or causing serious injury.
Well, thank you for your clarity about that, because I know that the specifics are one of those things that tonight we have an opportunity to talk a little bit about. The many emails I've gotten, one of the concerns has been, what kind of projectiles were used. Many people heard that rubber bullets specifically were kind of among the array. So thanks for letting us know that you had those 3 individuals that were subjected to the bean bag, just so facts are very clear. A handful of questions about contraband and weapons that may have been on individuals there. So I'll read these together, and then you can talk a little bit about that, if you would, Chief. Is there any proof protesters had things like guns or bricks, and were any found on the 19 arrested? How do you determine that backpacks could be filled with weapons of destruction versus water bottles or medical supplies? Why did you not remove the people or tents with bricks quickly, just as you removed the individual brandishing the lighter shaped as a gun? And if officers suspected there were bricks or potential weapons downtown, could they search for and confiscate them? And then finally, kind of part of this thread of questions, there's video evidence and firsthand reports from protesters contradicting the narrative put forward about bricks and weapons. Obviously, officers saw something that others did not see while watching Facebook Live feeds. Are you going to provide any evidence to support your claims of those elements of the evening?
Yeah, so as far as bricks, there were some bricks on scene, not many, and that was in the area near where the tent was when we went up on next to the monument. We also was any weapons found on people that were arrested? The answer to that would be a number of the individuals that fled into the construction site. There was a building that was under construction. Those individuals were found to be in possession of rocks and other things to throw at the officers. When the officers came into that location, they dropped those materials and ran it further into the building. We were able to arrest those individuals. There was more than just the ones that they saw with rocks in their hands, but they were able to arrest them. So some of them were armed with rocks and things like that when we got inside of that building, and they were arrested. The others did not have any weapons on them at that time. A lot of pieces to that question. So the next piece to it, if you can steer me back in the right direction.
Sure. So, if you believe that people did have bricks or potential weapons, I mean, just as the individual that had the gun-shaped lighter was pulled away from the crowd, what tactics?
Well, so and that's a good
your
question.
Force have to make sure that those individuals who may be bent on.
So it is not illegal or against the law to possess a gun or a knife or even a brick at a peaceful protest, as long as you are not doing anything with it that is threatening or destructive to, any building or harmful to a person. So just like in the case where we had 5 individuals who came up, they had body armor on, they were armed with rifles and shotguns and, additional magazines. We looked at them, we talked to them, but after we made sure of what their intent was not to harm anyone, we allowed them to continue on. That's different than a case where the individual who took the object out that looked like a gun and started brandishing it in the air. That caused panic for a number of the people that were in the crowd, and they ran. And so that's when we moved in and grabbed that individual and took him into custody and was able to secure that item. We saw a number of people throughout the day that were armed, that were open carrying with a firearm on their side in a holster. So our ability or authority to take a weapon away from a person is limited to if they're actually doing something with it that's dangerous or destructive.
Okay. A few questions, Chief, about National Guard presence. Were we in charge of the situation or the Guard? And then what impact did the governor's provision of National Guard to local governments have in any escalation of the violence committed by the Athens-Clarke County Police Department? And then can you address why the National Guard was placed after the machine gun wielding members had left, not during or before?
Okay, so let me start off with how the National Guard ended up here. Whenever there's a situation where we needed resources, we had to go through what's called GEMA, the Georgia Emergency Management Association. And they actually are kind of evaluating different scenarios all across Georgia and will provide the resources that they think you need or that you request. So we called and said we need additional resources because we didn't feel that we had sufficient resources or a sufficient number of equipped and trained officers to deal with a large-scale civil unrest if it turned violent. And so the GEMA decides what type resources they're going to send you. And so they sent us some state troopers and they sent us some National Guard troops. So they could have sent us all troopers. They could have sent us all National Guard, or they could have sent us mutual aid from another local agency if that would have been available. So when we make the ask, we ask for additional resources and they make the decision who they send. Early on in this event, the actions of the National Guard were simply to have a post at intersections to help us block off traffic and keep the individuals that were in a certain area secured or safe, where a car didn't drive up on them while they were protesting. At one point, the protesters blocked off Broad Street, so we wanted to make sure they were in an area where they could continue to safely protest until we moved them out of the area. The National Guard's involvement was very limited. What happened is that they moved up to the back of our formation as we moved in case things did turn violent. We would have additional resources to assist us. So they were visible, but they were not actively engaged in our dispersal of the crowd. We had our SRT team that was the one that actually went up and dispersed the crowd, directly followed by state police. And we used state police in that position because they have the protective gear that's necessary when something like that is being done. Our officers, as I mentioned earlier, don't have that yet, or didn't have it at the time. But even the state police were back. Our officers were the ones that engaged. And then after they got the three people up off of out of the street who was sitting in the street, they got those people up and passed them off to state police just to take them back to the arrest van. So a very limited involvement by either National Guard or state police.
Okay, thank you for that. Little questions about the participants and any intelligence kind of around them. And I'll take a handful of these together at once. And the first cluster is, how do you determine that people were members of the Boogaloo movement other than the very visible ones? And I think implicit in the question is, how did you know that there were more behind them? And then how many arrests have been identified as part of that movement? Kind of following up, based on appearance, how did ACCPD determine that some demonstrators were not from Athens? And then what impact would having being or not being from Athens have on police enforcement? And then says, given the prevalence of misinformation campaigns and false flag operations by the Boogaloo movement and others, how do you determine whether intelligence is credible and actionable? And was the review process followed prior to the deployment of less lethal force?
That's a lot, sir. So
maybe if you could carry us through from intelligence and observation to arrest, and talk about what was visibly known, what was known through intelligence, and then what was determined upon arrest.
Sure. And so, but what I will say is that because of security agreements, there's certain information that I'm not at liberty to share, but I can tell you some information that I can share. First off, again, we were communicating with the FBI, Georgia Bureau of Investigation, state police, and other people who had assets in a number of different places. We had assets, both covert and visible assets, on the ground throughout the day as the protest was taking place. So we had active, live operatives that were engaging, that were pushing information back out to us about who was there, what their intent was, and as much information as they could gather actually from on the scene. We also had police officers who, through their own observation, while we are studying and understanding and knowing how groups like Boogaloo operate, saw signs and symptoms that there were Boogaloo both there during the day and within that last crowd when we actually went to disperse the crowd. Some of it dealt with clothing, but other information that we know suggests that those people are involved with Boogaloo. So if you wear a certain kind of shirt, there's information that ties you to the Boogaloo. But if a person just chose to wear an Hawaiian shirt that day while he was protesting, they may have been mistaken for a Boogaloo member. But the best information that we had through the intelligence that we got from those different intelligence sources that were on the ground at that time, as well as the personal observations, throughout the day, we saw a number of vehicles driving around in the area that had out-of-state tags. Now, and that in and of itself doesn't mean anything, but we still were observing things like that to see whether they could have a tie there. But as far as the people on the ground, their appearance. The other thing is, as you know, we're a very community-oriented police department. We have our officers out in the community and engage in the community on a regular basis. And so our officers know a lot of the people within our community. They don't know all, but they don't know many, many of them. And we were seeing faces and people who we did not know. And so, again, that's not 100%, but it's still contributed to our belief that people were here from outside of Athens-Clarke County. And then one other question you mentioned dealt with how did we know that people were Boogaloo? And a couple of ways, and some of it is what I just talked to you about there, the way that they dress, but they self-identified that they were members of Boogaloo. We walked up to them, we asked them, you've got guns, you've got vests, we want to know what your intentions are and who you are. And they self-identified that they were Boogaloo. And they claimed that they were not there to do any violence or anything. They were just there to protect the citizens or protect the protesters. You asked the question about how do we determine what information is credible or
That's right.
And so this is another tricky part. All of those agencies that I talked about, the FBI, the GBI, and all of those agencies have a process where they look at the information they get and they determine whether they feel that it's credible or not. And so those processes involve everything from matching it up to see whether it's consistent with other information that they've got, matching it up to see whether the operatives that are on the ground are reporting the same information that we're seeing from other sources. So there's a whole variety of ways that you go about determining whether information is credible or not. And at the end of the day, you want to be very certain, but there's no way you're going to be 100% that all of the information is going to be accurate.
All right, a couple of questions about sort of locals versus out of town folks. Was the determination of having 6 addresses outside of Athens made based on the address on the ID, or just by confirmation, verbal confirmation from the individuals? And then why did the 13 people arrested have ACC addresses if police believe that there were a large portion of people who were from out of town?
Yeah, and so the first part of that question was, how did we determine who was from here and who was from out of town? That was through self-report. Some of them did have IDs that we were able to look at and confirm, but also through them self-reporting where they lived at. The 13 people who lived here, look, we knew that some of the people that were in that crowd were locals. There's no question about that. We also knew that early on when we began to try to disperse the crowd, and up until just about the very end of it, there were still individuals from the Boogaloo that we believe that were in that crowd, and that was the information we had. If you remember that there was a crowd of 200 or so just before we tried to disperse that crowd, and we made 19 arrests. So a lot of people, our objective was not to arrest people. Our objective was to get people to leave. So there was many people that ran away from that scene that we were not able to, were not interested in arresting. I wish that our officers would have focused on the outsiders and people who were the ones that were most involved in throwing things at the police and picking up the gas canisters. And that's something that I've relayed to my officers, that I'd like you to focus on them as you go in. If we had to do that all over again, prayerfully, hopefully we won't have to, but it would have been a better situation if we would have been able to take the leaders out and demonstrate who these people were that were coming and causing problems.
Thank you, Chief. There's a question about what was different at midnight than at 9 o'clock. And I'll get into a little bit of this. We of course know that there was this mutual aid agreement between the state and local government. The state did indicate that they had to withdraw their resources. They had to move to other locations. So maybe that's a lead into you talking a little bit about trying to figure out, all right, tactically on the ground, if you have only local assets versus this array of assets, local and state, does that change the dynamic between 9 p.m. and post midnight?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, we were aware that assets were needed that had been deployed to us. Those assets were needed elsewhere, that our officers, my officers, did not have the training and did not have the equipment that was necessary to be effective in that kind of an environment. And so rather than waiting longer, we decided that we were going to disperse at that time while we had the assets that we needed to be able to be effective at that. As you know, during our discussion that night, my preference was to just let them camp there all night. And as long as they weren't destroying anything or harming anything, that we would not approach. But there were some outside driving factors that did speed up that timetable.
So the concern was that should there be a convergence or violent act, we didn't want that to occur without state resources there as support. We didn't want what we've seen in Atlanta and St. Paul and so many places to happen without that broader force.
Yeah, I don't know that. I don't know, and I'm pretty certain we wouldn't have been able to control a situation like that without having the state resources available to us. Because, as I said earlier, my officers were not trained or equipped to deal with that kind of situation.
All right. Well, and that for me seems like kind of a lesson learned moving forward, particularly around that engagement. If there's anything we can do to, as I've described to a couple of people, sort of cleave off the bad actors from the peaceful protesters, that's absolutely what we want to do so that we don't get any mounting level of activity on anybody's part, gathering individuals' parts or our part as the government. Couple questions just about the nature of some of the charges. Aside from a failure to disperse, were there any other crimes being committed by the gathered demonstrators? And then once dispersing did happen, can you talk a little bit about what this writer describes as blocking off of exits?
Blocking, I'm sorry, I didn't hit it.
Of blocking off of exits. So the writer asks, why did the city deter protesters from dispersing to comply with the order, I guess the curfew order, by blocking off exits? So I guess the idea is, why couldn't you kind of go up College Avenue to get your car?
Yeah, so what happened is we had already cleared the downtown area, and there was a footprint for the area where the emergency declaration impacted. So we wanted to push people out of that area. So no one was allowed to go back up any of the side streets toward the downtown area. They had to continue down Broad Street until they got past Oconee. And so we did block that off, and we did stop people and make them go down. Now, if they came up that street, we didn't arrest them. We just told them, you can't come up here, go back and go down Broad Street. As far as the charges are concerned, there were other charges that were applicable. We could have charged pretty much all of them with blocking a state highway because they were blocking Broad Street there. We did see some of them that had rocks in their hands, but they charged all of them with the same one low-level charge, just to be consistent. But there were other charges that we could have charged beyond what we ended up charging them with.
So in terms of charges, Chief, and obviously you are not the prosecutor in court, you're sort of the arresting entity, but what's the usual punishment for breaking curfew?
It probably sometimes, and most of the time, it's simply going to be a fine, a low-level fine. If and there's not going to be any jail time involved, and so the magistrate would typically, when they get there, give them a personal recognizance bond and just give them basically a curfew. Say, stay out of that area. If you go back down there, then they would take you into jail. And typically, it's going to be a low-level fine involved in the punishment if they do any fine.
All right, and then a question about the arrest. If there was intelligence of danger, why were arrests not made until after tear gas was employed? So I guess put another way, in my own words, Chief, if you knew that 15 out of the 60 people were dangerous, could you not go and direct your arrest toward those dangerous individuals?
Yeah, and that goes back to that initial decision as far as, do we approach and interact versus going to the gas. And so typically when something is going to go from peaceful to violent is going to be at that point when you begin to interact and try to separate them out of that crowd and place charges against them. And so that would have been at a time where they were still very tightly interacting with many locals who, I'm sure the locals didn't realize who they were dealing with and who these people were and what their intention were or was. And so that was the reason for us not making that kind of a decision.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to, again, everything we can possibly do to sort of minimize dangerous interaction. A handful of folks have indicated to me directly through email, hey, there were people who were encouraging us to throw stuff, and we were basically telling them to, go take a hike. We're not about that. And And so, and again, I'm not a tactician, and so I don't want to pretend to have knowledge that I don't. But to the degree that we can say, hey, if you're here to be peaceful, all right, and you do want to be arrested, come on over here and we will do that. If you are not here to be peaceful, then we're going to have to deal with you in a different way. Some questions about how did the break-in at Academy Sports relate to the downtown activity? Was there an entity or organization that was responsible for these break-ins, and was that in any way tied to the protest?
And so the answer to that, well, early on we received information and intelligence that said that during these protests, what will happen is because all of they will assume that all of your assets are going to be tied up dealing with an event downtown. Then they will assume that you're don't have units that will be able to respond to other things that's going on in the county. And that intelligence also indicated that there were certain businesses that were kind of high value targets, that if this was going to take place, it would have take place at our gun stores. So we identified 3 gun stores, Clyde's, Franklin, and the Academy store, where guns are sold as likely high targets. And so we reached out to those individuals beforehand, the owners of those shops, and told them to be on guard, and that if they got an alarm, make sure that they let us know, and to take safety steps, because that was the intelligence that we had. And so sometime after 1, I can't remember what time it was, but it was as this thing was actively unfolding, we got information that there was some activity at the Academy store. And when officers responded, they found a number of individuals either inside of the store or fleeing away from that store, and the store had been burglarized. A number of those individuals did have associations with a gang called Pyru Bloods, and then how are they associated with the protest downtown? The information and intelligence we had was that the information was relayed to certain individuals that would take place. Beyond them simply reaching out to gang members and saying, this will be a good time for you to commit this burglary because we're going to have them tied up somewhere else, I don't know that there would be any large association between them.
Okay, so basically it was a 2 separate sets of actors. The downtown folks, again, sort of recognizing that most of the folks downtown were very peaceful, and that there was a small group of disruptors, and then basically a separate organized group who were taking advantage of the fact.
That's correct. And we had plenty of advanced information through our intelligence that was going to occur.
Okay, thank you, sir. A few more questions about tear gas before we sort of get into some more summary thoughts. What is your perspective, or law enforcement's perspective, around use of tear gas, particularly in a respiratory health crisis, and knowing some of the specific effects that it has on the human body? And then, is it the stated policy of the PD to preemptively use tear gas to stop the future commission of crimes?
So I'll take the first question related to health and the current COVID-19 pandemic. I don't have any information that would say that even if a person is affected with COVID-19, that this would somehow make the infection worse or affect that individual. This again is an irritant, and it burns the skin and it burns the mucous membranes in the eyes. But it could affect a person's breathing, because breathing is going to be restricted to an extent. But within 30 minutes, pretty much all of the effects of gas would have worn off. Second part of that question, I'm sorry.
So second part of that question, is it the stated policy to use tear gas as a preemptive measure to prevent crime?
So there's not a stated policy that dictates one way or another when it's supposed to be used. It's included in the continuum of force, and the officer has discretion to use it when it's necessary based on the facts and circumstances that they're faced with.
All right. And of course, this coming Wednesday, we're going to talk more broadly about policing policy, policing practice. At that point, we'll talk about the community police advisory body that's being formed right now. We'll talk policing philosophy. We'll talk where we're going in community policing and other means. So I encourage people to tune in then so we can kind of do the deeper dive into the long arc of police activity, kind of well beyond this moment. So some really kind of summary areas. Why were the peaceful protests over the past weekend treated so differently and with such an excessive use of force compared to the election protests in 2016, the women's marches since 2016, the Occupy Wall Street movement, et cetera? I can say for myself, and then I'd like to let the managers and tacticians provide some perspective. I look at the history of American civil action. And here in 2020, obviously we're in a different kind of a circumstance than we were in 2016, a different kind of circumstance than we were in at the impending Iraq War in 2003-4, different than really any time I can think of in my lifetime from 1971, probably stretching back to, what I read about the very late 60s rioting. I can't think of a national dynamic that carried with it series of incidents of violence from Los Angeles to Minneapolis to Atlanta. For me, the context is certainly a factor in my mind, and just realizing that, unfortunately, like any of those other incidents that the writer mentions, there is a violent current, and again, I don't believe it's by far the majority. I think it's a small minority, and I live every day wanting to make sure that everybody wakes up safe and happy and productively in Athens. And as a community leader, I am fearful for things that are going to compromise people's life and health, as we see in so many places. I'll say for myself, that's a distinction in this moment versus any of those other national periods, or periods that had maybe a geographic isolation. You think the post-Rodney King beating riots in 1992, or activities following Ferguson. This is dramatic and weighty for me as a community leader and policymaker, and I don't know how you guys feel, but that's how I've reflected on this last couple of weeks. Okay.
Well, I would offer this. I think that protests and marches and rallies are just part of our local fabric here, and as I stated earlier, it is who we are, and we don't sit idly by. We voice our displeasure with injustice. In my office here in City Hall, I bear witness to many of these marches, and the question being is, why was this so different? And I want just to say that it is not maybe what's unfolding elsewhere, where there's just perhaps a disregard of those rights, or of the content and intent of the protest. That has not been our practice here. It was different this time, perhaps because of factors that we don't usually have. And at the time, and then it quickly unfolding, and we can certainly look in retrospect. But that was a different approach to this because of different factors. And I think we should continue to talk this through and weigh decisions that were made and learn from those. And I think with cooperation from both the folks that are on the ground and our local officials, that we can find that balance that would preserve people's rights and keep them secure.
Yeah, I mentioned this kind of number of local activities and activities in other communities in Atlanta and Norfolk and elsewhere that I've been part of, and I've never been part of one where people brought firearms. And certainly knowing the intelligence that you mentioned, Chief, is a distinguishing dynamic from anything I've been aware of prior to this. But I look forward to us doing better and being better. Couple more questions. What steps do the mayor and ACCPD plan to take to ensure better targeting of actual dangerous persons and better communications? And I've talked a little bit about that direct engagement. Certainly, I think if there's anything that this community does well, it is public engagement, and it's making sure that we hear the voices of people. That's true from our citizen committees to I think the way I've generally conducted my office pre-COVID. It was a pretty open door, and anybody was welcome to spend time. And I want to see that applied to the street, even in challenging times. Chief, I don't know if there's anything you want to follow up on.
Yeah, so we learn and we improve every time we go through different situations. One thing that I think we will be doing, I know that we're doing this time that will improve our communication, is we'll be setting up a tip line so that folks can communicate directly with a center to pass along information about things that they're seeing. As you heard me say before, the eyes and ears of a vigilant community are the most valuable tool that we have to let us know what's going on in our communities. And so we'll be looking for the people who are there peacefully protesting to hopefully let us make us aware if they're seeing things or things that are being done that they feel are suspicious, and we'll be looking for their help there. And we'll just do many of the things that we did during this previous protest that allowed us to make sure that for many hours, people were able to protest peacefully and without any incident. And that was done from, 5 o'clock in the afternoon until about 8 o'clock. So that's some of the things we'll be doing.
Last couple questions sort of are about the intersection of the COVID period that we're in with this. Chief, and maybe this would be for the sheriff's department more than you, but the question is, why were people arrested, put in a tiny room with no PPE during a pandemic, potentially making the health infectious situation worse?
And so I coordinated with the sheriff's department for an arrest plan. We were to take the people from the location if arrests had to take place and turn them over to the sheriff's department, and then they were they dealt with the whole arrest processing. So I couldn't really speak to that issue. I don't know the answer to that question.
And then other COVID question is, why is a group of several hundred people, many without masks, allowed to congregate downtown Athens? Did they need a permit that was specific to this period? And this was very impromptu activity. It wasn't a kind of permit-oriented activity. I will say I've talked to some public health professionals today, a handful of them, in fact, because there were people who were engaged in the rally this last Sunday, including our colleague, Commissioner Parker, who've tested positive for COVID. And so public health professionals have indicated that if you were next to somebody within 6 feet for 15 minutes or more, and they tested positive, you very much need to get tested. I encourage everybody to go to our website at acc.gov.com/coronavirus, and information about testing centers is there. Anybody symptomatic or asymptomatic, believed to be in contact or not, is able to get a test now. And so I encourage anybody concerned to do that, and also encourage everybody that's going to be attending the coming rally be very conscious. I think I might have said earlier that the mask action on Sunday was so much greater than at the grocery store any time that I've seen over the last 10 weeks. People were very heavily masked. That's so important. But as one of the health professionals told me today, wearing a mask doesn't make you absolutely immune. If you're still in close contact with somebody for an extended period of time, that's still a health risk. And so that's something that everybody should know about being in that kind of environment that public health professionals want the community to be aware of. So I need to share that message. I want to get a couple closing thoughts from everybody. I hope this has been valuable for the public. I know you'll continue to have questions. Again, the chief and I will be gathering again this coming Wednesday at 6 p.m. in another one of these forums. And so you'll have the opportunity to ask other questions more broadly about policing. I know I've gotten several emails about how the police apparatus is going to evolve to ensure a variety of tactics and a variety of community supports, including social work. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that then. Chief, closing thoughts?
Sure. In closing, I want to reassure the community that our objective will always be to facilitate the peaceful protests, but also to ensure the safety and security of all of the people that might be participating at those events. As in any operation of this magnitude that took place last Sunday, there are some things that we can do better. And I certainly am going to be focusing on the concerns that many citizens have raised about how we reacted there and looking to try to improve is as far as how we, with our tactics and how we operate. And I just want everybody to be safe.
All right. Thank you, Chief. Assistant Manager Lonon.
I hope that this conversation has provided some additional information for our residents. I follow a lot of the comments online. One, because I'm friends with a lot of people in the community, and two, because it's always my desire to understand the heart of the residents that I aim to serve and to understand what the needs are. And I think initially there was some misinformation. I hope that this conversation has answered some questions, but I also know that there are many other questions and that there are some people whose perspective won't be changed. But I do hope that we all understand, specifically concerning comments about ACC government doesn't care, ACC government is against us. We're not against Athens-Clarke County residents. I am not against Athens-Clarke County residents. And I know that the bigger picture here is coming together to combat this violence, this racism, the numerous deaths that have been occurring for a long time. And now we're coming together stronger, speaking up more loudly, and taking a stance. I'm not against the stance. But I just hope that we are all aware that the goal here is to keep everyone safe as we continue to combat this together. I would say that personally, I have been impacted, as many residents have been, by the senseless killings that haven't been going on just for years, but have been going on for decades and lifetimes and generations. And I personally cannot get Mr. Floyd's murder out of my head. I can't get the thought of a man, a grown man calling out for his mama out of my head because I'm a mom, and so many of us are. So again, I want to remind Athens-Clarke County residents that it's not that we don't care, it's not that we are against protests, but we are obligated to protect our residents. And I hope that we can come together and continue to work together to see real impactful change. And it's all of us in this together, including Athens-Clarke County police officers.
Thank you. Manager Williams.
I really can't say it much better than Assistant Manager Lonon. But I do want to recognize the employees and the people, the husbands, the mothers, the sisters, the uncles that make up the employees of our government. They are people that live in Athens and around Athens, and Athens is a regional center of which we all deeply care. And we really are, and the folks on this call and the folks that work for the government are public servants first and foremost. And I agree with Assistant Manager Lonon that our job day in, day out is to provide fundamental services that improve the lives of all of our citizens. And that's something that we don't want to deviate from. This was a very tough situation. As everybody has said, we're committed to doing better. We're committed to this weekend being everything that it can be. And that, I think, is evidenced by the coordination and the time and the preparation that we're making for this weekend. And I hope that everyone would remain safe. I urge you to take advantage, to express yourself with everything that's going on nationally. Let's celebrate, too, that it is not something that's existed here routinely, although we have things to work on. Please be careful. Wear your mask if you tend to come. Try to stay away from other folks. Let's hear your voice. If you see something, say something. The police will be very close and within the crowd and around the crowd. And our only intent is that you come and you exercise your rights and that you get home safely.
Thank you, sir. In closing, I just want to say thank you to every member of the Athens community for being as dedicated as you are to those ideals of justice that have been denied so many for so long, that Deborah mentioned poignantly. And we want that justice to be true here every day in Athens. If we can manage a city with 120,000 rowdy football fans, we can certainly manage a city filled with people in the streets seeking justice. No doubt about that. And no matter what you might hear from Pennsylvania Avenue about what is supposed to happen on the streets, in some people's minds, these are, in Athens, streets of love, streets of solidarity, and streets of interest in one another's safety and health. So I'm sorry for anybody whose safety and health was compromised this week, and I pledge that we are going to continue to, as you've heard again, do the utmost to make sure that this is a model city, an ideal city. You know, I have peers in many communities who I interact with, from Madison, Wisconsin to Austin, Texas, and they're facing these same challenges. But I believe that here in Athens, we're going to rise to these challenges better than any of those places because of the level of engagement we have with one another. So when I'm walking down the street, I look forward to seeing all of you. I look forward to your phone calls. Look forward to each of you continuing to work for the greatest amount of justice emanating from within this institution in every one of our offices, including the police department. Thank you for your time tonight. And again, the chief will be joining me next Wednesday, June 10th at 6 p.m. Godspeed and God bless.